From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Walt Fick is standing by to discuss herbicide control of Sericea Lespedeza in pastures, saying that now is the time to treat this noxious weed, which continues to spread in Kansas. Also today, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney, and from Oklahoma State University, Brian Pugh will talk about Teff, a summer annual forage option that's capturing greater attention for its production potential here in the Central Plains. They'll look at the production requirements for Teff and its nutritional value for livestock. And further ahead on this week's horticulture segment, Ward Upham will talk about 2 lawn pest problems to contend with right now. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and thanks as always for listening in. Well, on this opening segment, we want to bring you up to the moment on control measures for a notorious noxious weed in our Kansas grasslands. It's called Sericea Lespedeza. We've invited by Range and Pasture Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Walt Fick, to fill us in on the latest strategies against this invasive weed species. And just to put it into context, Walt, we now see Sericea not only concentrated in the grasslands of eastern Kansas, but much further west as well, you say.
Yes, there are some counties in the western third to half of the state that do have Sericea. Probably got there in the CRP, I think, primarily. But if it's there and going to seed, for instance, it probably is just a matter of time before it escape into adjacent rangeland type areas. But yeah, there's plenty in the state. I think the last estimates I saw were about 600,000 acres or so. Primary problem in the eastern part of the state, but it's also out in the west.
Has it taken over for musk thistle as public enemy number 1 as weeds go in our grasslands?
Well, if you look at it from an acre standpoint, I think it's about number 3 on the list now, but behind bindweed and musk thistle. But Sericea is a lot tougher species to control, frankly, than musk thistle. Sericea is a perennial, so even if you keep it from going to seed, those plants keep coming back from year to year. Musk thistle, the only way it reproduces is by seed. So if you make a concerted effort keeping musk thistle from going to seed for a couple of years, you can really reduce that population. It's just a matter of doing it.
Sericea, on the other hand, is that much more persistent. And you might go back over the basic biology of it, what it looks like, and that's important because it can be confused with other types of Lespedezas, can it not?
Yeah, if you've never seen it, that's one of the first things you need to be able to do is identify what it looks like. And it can be confused with some other plants. It is a legume. It has trifoliate leaves, 3 leaflets, and a key thing we use to help identify it is the shape of those leaves. They're kind of wedge or club-shaped. There is another native Lespedeza that some people might confuse it with, but the leaf shape is different. But yeah, learning how to identify it is key. Depending where you're at in the state in the growing season, it can be fairly tall. It's a nice herbaceous plant when it comes out in the spring, but it'll get 3, in southeast Kansas, maybe even 6-7 feet tall under really good growing conditions. And about midsummer, it starts to branch, gets kind of a woody stem. So it almost looks like a shrub at that point in time instead of a herbaceous plant.
And the reason we talk about it so much is that once it gets established and starts to prolifically produce that seed, it can take over a patch of grass.
Yes, it definitely can take over. It's quite competitive. It's not a real strong seedling. It takes it a while, but once it's established, gets a root system under it, it's quite competitive and will reduce your overall species diversity. There are plants that just can't compete with it. And, a good-sized plant can produce probably in excess of 1,000 seeds. So it's not, as much as we've mentioned the musk thistle, but it still produces plenty of seed, and that's still probably the primary way it gets spread around is by seed.
And the seed can stay viable in the soil for years upon years to add to the aggravation.
Yes, I'm not sure exactly how long. I usually just say decades. I've seen numbers like 20 years maybe stated, but it's out there for a long time. Actually, I think a fairly small percentage of that seed that's there in what we call the seed bank, probably near the soil surface, probably a small percentage actually will germinate in a given year, 5, maybe 10%, even though that seed can stay viable for a long time.
So then, we want to focus for the most part today on chemical control of Sericea. We're talking about herbicide options here because we're nearing the time that those should go on, you say, Walt.
Yes, the month of June is a really good time to think about treating Sericea if you have it with a herbicide. It's in a vegetative state. At this point in time, it's probably a foot or two tall even by this time with the moisture that we've had here in the last month, I think. So there's some herbicides that we typically can use. Probably the two key ones when it's in this vegetative state, there's a product called, and I'll use trade names, some of these have generics, but Remedy Ultra is one of our long-standing products. The label talks about 1 to 2 pints, but a pint and a half per acre, if we're going to broadcast of Remedy Ultra, has worked quite well for us. The other key one is Pasture Guard HL. Pasture Guard does have triclopyr in it, which is the active ingredient in Remedy, but then it has a second chemical in it called fluroxypyr. It's a variable rate, too, depending on maybe size of the plant and how dense, 3/4 to a pint and a half per acre, though, with Pasture Guard HL. The other product that probably doesn't get talked about as much for this time of the year is a product called Surmount. Surmount is a restricted use product, though, because it does contain picloram. So it's a combination of picloram and the fluroxypyr, and the rate on it is about 2 pints per acre. But it's one that, right now we're probably about the tail end of treating rough-leaf dogwood, which we've talked about in previous sessions. And if it's still blooming or in that late bloom stage, Surmount is one of the better products to use on rough-leaf dogwood. Well, if you're doing that and you happen to have Sericea Lespedeza around, you can use Surmount also to treat the Sericea.
Now, you have tested all of these products out in independent K-State field trials. So as far as control expectations, what can one truly anticipate here, Walt?
Well, I think if you look at it that same season you've treated, you're going to see pretty high defoliation rate with all of those, approaching 100%. But normally, you go out about a year after you treat and see how much did you actually reduce that population. And generally, I would hope to get better than 90% mortality a year after treatment with all three of those. I have studied those products in some dry years. I was waiting in June for it to rain, and it never did, so it was early July before I treated. And actually, out of those products, the one that seemed to work the best under those conditions actually was the Pasture Guard product, where it was, like I say, 90%, I think, mortality a year later, and the Remedy and Surmount were less than that.
If one, Walt, is looking at a spot application for a constricted Sericea outbreak, then, would they use the same chemistry by and large?
Pretty much. Again, depending on time of the year, as we're talking about this early summer time frame, yes, the Remedy Ultra, I think I've talked about using a 1% solution. That actually is, if you talk about fluid ounces, that's like a little over 1 1/4 fluid ounces in a gallon. I've seen other spot treatments, I'll talk about maybe 2/3 of an ounce in a gallon. Well, that's closer to the equivalent to that 1 pint rate. So again, but something around, that maybe a fluid ounce in a gallon seems to work pretty well with the Remedy. Pasture Guard, again, probably a 1/2 to 1 fluid ounce per gallon of water, again, for spot treatment. Those things are usually discussed on the labels, so check out the labels, but those are I think, the typical rates that we probably would use at least this time of the year.
But in all cases here, and you've talked of this in the past, one's going to have to commit to a routine of treatment over the next several years to really knock Sericea out for good, if that can be achieved.
Yeah, it's because of that long-term seed viability. It's really a tough one to deal with. There's no silver bullet that's going to take it out with even one or two treatments. So you need to have a plan. I think the people that have been fighting this for the last 20 to 30 years, they find themselves probably treating every second or third year on a routine basis. You set it back for a while and gets the population such that it's really not reducing your other forage production, something you can live with. But over time, it starts coming back, and you need to treat it again.
And is there merit in a combination of approaches here, chemical combined with mechanical from time to time, or timely burning of pasture?
Yes, we've been looking at, this even summer burns, something in, let's say, August and even into early September. Those summer burns seem to eliminate a viable seed production on those plants. But those plants come back. You're still going to have to do something with those, I think, because more than likely you're not going to be able to burn summer all the time. You periodically might want to do that. But even then, if I were to burn in August, I might wait 3 or 4 weeks and spray those seedlings that are coming up. I think you'll get a better control that way. Same thing with mowing. Mowing by itself, I tried that in that mid to late July when we talk about putting up prairie hay. Did, just a single mowing. After 4 or 5 years, I was starting to reduce the stand, but it wasn't eliminated, but it was going down. But still, one thing it probably did, kind of like that summer burn, it maybe would eliminate seed production that year, but those plants still come back. It would take repeated mowing, and out in the prairie, we can't do that because we're going to hurt all the plants in that case. So usually, again, following up mowing machine, and again, 3 to 4 weeks after I would mow it, treat the resprouts with a herbicide.
The encouragement is producers get those treatments on here in the coming days in this month of June. Walt, thank you for coming over, as always.
Thanks, Eric.
On Sericea Lespedeza control with herbicide applications, that's Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We'll return shortly with more on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today is back now. Well, as someone who's been in this agricultural radio business for a while now, it's rather gratifying to see more and more of our agricultural experts at K-State putting together podcasts to get the word out to you producers on this subject or that. One such new endeavor is a weekly podcast that our good friend Jaymelynn Farney is now hosting. Jaymelynn, as you know, is a research and extension beef systems specialist for K-State, based in southeast Kansas. And she's been good enough to allow us to share today part of a recent podcast of hers with you right here. It covers a summer annual forage option that's rapidly gaining attention here in the Central Plains. Here's Jaymelynn and her guest to talk about it.
The topic of today's podcast will be Teff as a forage for cattle producers. I've been receiving quite a lot of interest about this specific forage, and I've asked Brian Pugh, who is with Oklahoma State in the Northeast Experiment Station, to come and visit with us, as he's had quite a bit of experience with Teff. Teff, actually a warm season annual grass that's native to Ethiopia and has been grown mostly as a cereal grain for human consumption. But here in the U.S., we've started discovering that Teff grass makes a good annual forage hay crop. It has a lot of rapid regrowth after cutting, and you can get multiple cuts if you provide adequate management. Brian, what do you like about Teff as a forage option for cattle producers?
Yeah, I guess some of the things that I like about Teff when it comes to, being a good forage, first and foremost, is quality. Extremely high quality when we look at it in regards to crude protein and TDN or energy of that forage. We can rival early bloom to mid bloom alfalfa pretty easily on the first cutting and be similar to late bloom alfalfa on second and possibly third cuttings, depending on, our management through the summer, how many cuttings we can get. So I really like the quality of Teff. First and foremost. Second would probably be yield. It's a really good yielding forage. I've done numerous trials in Oklahoma, and when I look at average yields on those trials, typically I'm going to be somewhere around 4 to 6 tons of production for the summer at pretty moderate nitrogen input rates. So again, that's decent, respectable production. Another thing that's really interesting about Teff that we're starting to see more and more is its nitrogen efficiency. So most of our warm season forages like Bermuda grass or sorghum Sudan, crabgrass, they take about 50 pounds of nitrogen for each additional ton of production that we want to make. Teff is unique in that it actually takes about 30 pounds of nitrogen. So it's much more efficient. It scavenges that nitrogen, that free nitrogen from the soil much better because it has an extremely fibrous root system. And again, that's money in our pocket that we're not having to use on extra urea, ammonium nitrate, or UAN applications. And then I guess, I don't know, one of the last things I would hit on why I like it is probably why I started looking at Teff following the drought of 2011 and 12 was as a drought-tolerant forage. I had so many producers that, again, just didn't make really any forage for the whole summer. We were so dry. And the ones who had planted annuals, such as sorghum Sudan, had major nitrate issues in those forages. And Teff had really been promoted in the literature as a drought-tolerant, low or no nitrate type forage, and that was something that intrigued me, and that's kind of where I started my research in 2012 with it.
And when you had said moderate nitrogen, what was that kind of range you're talking about?
Most of the time, again, when I look at averages across our trials across the state, I can get to about 5 tons of production, 10 to 11,000 pounds of forage production for the year on 150 pounds of nitrogen. Now, that includes soil nitrogen. So again, if you're on fairly high soil nitrogen levels, it takes much less applied nitrogen to get there. So yeah, pretty intriguing the way Teff works when it comes to nitrogen efficiency.
And on that 150, do you like to split it out over multiple applications or all up front?
We do. Matter of fact, most of my trials in Oklahoma have shown very little, if any, differences between N rates. So all my fertility trials, I try to run 0 to 250 pounds of actual N in 50-pound increments. And I've only had one trial that showed a significant difference between those rates on the first cutting. Now, again, second and third cutting, it's going to be very important to go ahead and supplement that nitrogen to keep that crop growing. So my desire is to get a good soil test, see where your nitrate levels are in the soil. If you're double digits on nitrate level, that's plenty for the first cutting, and then put 50 to 100 units or pounds of actual N after that first cutting, and that should take you through the rest of the growing season there.
And so when you were talking about, one of the things you really thought was great about Teff as a warm season annual, especially as compared to sorghum Sudan, is its nitrate or low levels of nitrate. Are there any other characteristics of that Teff you think makes it really nice as a cattle feed?
Yeah, some of the things I guess we look for in all forages is animal acceptance, and just by the physical nature of the Teff plant, it's extremely fine stemmed. It also has very fine, delicate type leaves that are somewhat succulent. Whether you're grazing or whether you're belling that as hay, it's very palatable to the animals. They accept it very readily, and it doesn't matter if it's cattle, horses, sheep, goats. We've run trials on all of those, and they accept Teff just as well as any other forage. So I like that. I also like the fact Teff has a pretty high digestibility, being an annual, and also being somewhat fine-stemmed. It has lower basically fiber in the stem, which leads to higher digestibility. So animals tend to gain really well on teff compared to some of the other options that we have out there. And I know we're kind of focusing on cattle here today, but one of the niches that I see expanding here in Oklahoma, especially around that Tulsa area, is in the horse hay market. And, one of the things to remember about teff is it's extremely low in non-structural carbohydrates, starches, and sugars. And that can be a real issue for horses that have metabolic issues or laminitis. They're prone to founder. Teff is extremely safe for those horses. Especially if we harvest it right before the heading stage. And the caveat of that is that's extremely high quality, much like alfalfa. So we get a very high quality, safe forage for horses as well. And I think that's what's helped lead to the popularity in teff in the hay market.
Yes, and everything I've had graze or eat teff hay, you just can't put enough of it out there. You get the smell of native prairie hay, but finer stemmed with more digestibility and higher quality. So, Brian, with all these things in mind, if a producer's looking to incorporate teff in their production system, where do you think it works?
That's a good question. That's probably one of the most common questions I got when I first started getting out to cattlemen's meetings and things like that and promoting teff as a possible forage. And I still think it works the best in a dedicated hay field for someone who's either commercially producing hay or wanting to produce very high quality hay for their own herd. Maybe hay that you could limit feed to a herd of beef cows. You don't have to feed 30 pounds a day. You might could feed 18 pounds a day and meet that cow's requirements. It works really well there. And again, with the horse hay market and the beef cow hay market the way that it has been, it can definitely put you very close to what we see as far as alfalfa, as far as economic returns. So I think it's viable in that hay category first and foremost. Secondly, the whole reason I started with it's basically as an emergency drought forage. If we get in a drought and we're trying to rely on something to give us some growth, traditionally we've always done that with, BMR sorghum or sorghum Sudan crosses. And those work really well. The problem is we tend to get extremely high nitrates when we're in drought with them. And I think that's where teff can help us, because in western Oklahoma, even where we're getting slightly elevated levels of nitrate and teff, it's much lower than what we see on the sorghum Sudan type crops. So I think that can help us there as well. Another thing that we're really seeing expand out in western Oklahoma, where wheat is kind of king out there, seeing a lot of producers roll in after wheat harvest and using teff as kind of a short season, either hay or grazing crop. Traditionally, we've really relied for grazing on volunteer crabgrass. Many of those producers are now planting teff because it opens up some options. They can either graze it, as we've talked about earlier, or they could go ahead and hay one or maybe two cuttings off that and, again, sell it, have another stream of revenue for the operation. So we're seeing a big increase in teff usage out in western Oklahoma for that reason.
Thank you, Brian, for joining me this week. Brian Pugh, he's an agronomist in Oklahoma State University, housed out of the Northeast area office. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Dr. Farney.
K-State's Jaymelynn Farney there with Oklahoma State's Brian Pugh. Now, there's much more to the story on teff production for forage, so we'd encourage you to take in the entire podcast. The series is entitled Dr. J's Beef, and you can access it by going to southeast.ksu.edu. Click on the Program Areas tab, then on Beef Cattle, the link to the podcast right there, or simply search online for Dr. J's Beef. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. And now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. The Kansas Department of Agriculture has announced that vesicular stomatitis virus, or VSV, has been confirmed in horses in Butler County in the south central part of the state. Kansas becomes the fourth state in the U.S. to have confirmed cases of VSV this year. The infected horses live on different private residences in that county. When the clinical signs were first identified on a premises in Butler County, the KDA contacted veterinarians in the region to alert them to the possibility of VSV. That led to additional suspect cases in the area, and upon receiving the laboratory confirmation, the KDA established a quarantine on the 3 affected premises. The KDA has tested a number of other animals in the region which are showing clinical signs consistent with VSV. They're awaiting the final laboratory testing on those. Now, Kansas Animal Health Commissioner Justin Smith is encouraging all livestock owners across the state to be aware of the clinical signs of VSV and follow the best practices to limit exposure to insects which vector it. VSV is a viral disease. It primarily affects horses, but can also affect cattle, sheep, goats, swine, llamas, and alpacas. In horses, VSV is typically characterized by lesions which appear as crusting scabs on the muzzle, lips, ears, coronary bands, or the ventral abdomen. The primary way the virus is transmitted is from biting insects like black flies, sandflies, and midges. VSV can also be spread by nose-to-nose contact between animals. The virus itself usually runs its course in 5 to 7 days, and then it can take up to an additional 7 days for the infected animal to recover from the symptoms. There are no USDA-approved vaccines for VSV. Now, infected animals may refuse to eat or drink. That can lead to weight loss. VSV can be painful for infected animals, and humans can also become affected with the disease while handling affected animals and can develop flu-like symptoms. So, for more information on VSV, including the documents outlining the symptoms, the fly control practices, and the current situation reports, go to the KDA website, agriculture.ks.gov/VSV. agriculture.ks.gov/VSV. A federal judge has ruled North Carolina's so-called ag-gag law unconstitutional in yet another loss for laws across the country designed to prevent animal rights groups from conducting undercover investigations of livestock operations. A number of animal rights groups, including PETA, filed the lawsuit claiming that the state's law would make it legally risky to conduct undercover investigations of animal research laboratories at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The North Carolina law prohibited anyone from intentionally gaining access to non-public areas and engages in an act that exceeds a person's authority to enter those areas liable to the owner or operator of the premises for any damages sustained. In defending the law in court, the state of North Carolina alleged the capturing of photos or videos while trespassing is not protected by the United States Constitution, but the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of North Carolina did not agree with that. How is agriculture benefiting from U.S. trade deals? Well, the U.S. Trade Representative reported on that to Congress yesterday. The USDA's Stephanie Ho reports.
U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer says agriculture has been one focus of U.S. trade policy.
Agriculture has been a huge, huge winner in the USMCA and in the China agreement, where we've seen literally billions and billions of new sales. In Japan, where we have, I know you are aware of this, but we have, I think last year was one of our best years ever in beef, and this year is like 25% above it.
His comments came in testimony before the House Ways and Means Committee.
The UK, we will have agricultural problems in that negotiations. I can guarantee you they will tend to be in the SPS area.
He says a second round of trade talks with Britain is wrapping up next week.
My own hope is that we have at least a couple of chapters at that point that we've closed out. We'll see if that happens. We don't have any at this point, but my hope would be we have at least a couple of chapters that are closed out. But it's still a long way to go, and there are very, very fundamental issues that we have to come to grips with.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, this week's Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi.
Steve Swaffer, Executive Director of No-Till on the Plains, joins us. And Steve, No-Till on the Plains and Country Crock recently introduced a cover crop collaboration. What are the details of this 3-year agreement?
We're really excited. This is going to be an opportunity for producers in eastern Kansas and the western tier of Missouri to get a little bit of help to plant cover crops on acres that have never been planted to cover crops before. So we will make reimbursement available for seed purchases to producers in those eastern tier of counties, up to $10 an acre for the purchase of that seed. We'll roll this program out beginning in September, and we're really excited about this partnership that we've formed with Upfield. That's the parent company of Country Crock.
Why a company like this to partner with?
Country Crock has a plant in Gardner, Kansas, in Johnson County, and so they source soybeans for oil that go into the product from that general vicinity. So we've centered the program sort of around that facility, but understanding there are a lot of folks and producers across that region that might benefit from the opportunity to put in cover crops and to learn about the soil health movement that's going on and how they might participate and improve the soil quality on their own farm.
Now, No-Till on the Plains, you'll be administering the new program.
Yes, we'll have somebody on staff who will work with the producers to make sure that we get the information that we need to get the information out to the producers of what they'll have to provide to No-Till on the Plains. And then once we receive that information and a receipt for the purchase of that seed, we'll cut those producers the check. There'll be an 80-acre minimum on that enrollment, but there is no maximum until we get to 13,000 acres across that region.
Now, will there be farmer information sessions or meetings that will be coming up here soon?
Yeah, we're in the planning process of those right now, Greg. So we'll do 3 of those this summer prior to the enrollment period. We'll probably stage those northeast Kansas, somewhere in western Missouri, and somewhere in southeast Kansas, August-September timeframe. So that's getting planned as we speak.
But if they want more information now, can they call you guys there at the office?
You can reach us at 785-210-4549. And we'll have information being updated on our website, www.notill.org, as it's made available.
That is Steve Swaffer, Executive Director of No-Till on the Plains, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly segment on horticulture. And across the way once more is horticulturist Ward Upham of K-State Research and Extension. We've asked Ward today to comment on a couple of common problems in our lawns at this stage of the summer and what you can do about each of these. One is a weed, one is an insect, and both, unfortunately, are quite familiar to homeowners. We want to talk about nutsedge growth in home lawns, and this is a quite invasive weed species, Ward.
It certainly is, but the control measures for nutsedge are totally different than what we use for certain other weedy grasses. And so first thing we need to do is just make sure we get it identified correctly. Now, it's lighter green and faster growing than the good turf grass. Well, so is orchard grass and some other stuff. Mm-hmm. And so how do you tell the difference? What you need to do is cut that plant off the base and look straight down on what you've cut. If it's triangular, it's a sedge. Grasses aren't triangular. They're going to be either round or they're going to be oval, but they're not going to be triangular. So let's say you do that, and it is nutsedge. Now, usually this shows up in areas where it's a little bit more moist than normal. Mm-hmm. Can be in other places, but that's where it tends to be. So worse in wet soils. What some people tend to do is try to pull it, and that's the exact wrong thing to do. Really? And the reason for that is it's called nutsedge for a reason. It has nutlets on those roots, and when you pull that mother plant, it activates all those nutlets.
So you rid of one and a host of others result.
That's exactly right. I mean, you can get rid of it that way. We had one of our professors that had a patch right outside the front door, and he pulled it every day when he got home from work, and it took several months to kill it. So that's what you're looking at. You're pulling it every day, and it's still going to take several months.
So chemical control is looking more attractive all the time in that instance then.
Yes, but again, you have to use something that's for nutsedge, not a regular weed control product. So when you look at these products, they're usually going to have sedge or nutsedge in the title. For example, some of the products that are out there are sedge hammer, nutsedge and horsetail control, sedge ender, and nutsedge control. And so there are a number of products out there. They contain one of two active ingredients. Both work well, so it doesn't matter what's in it. It's going to have something that should work pretty well. Now, the thing that is important is if you can put that first app down by June 21st, and we're getting really close to that, it helps. If you get later than that, sometimes those nutlets won't be controlled as well, and therefore you may end up with some more plants. Even if you do get it down before June 21st, you're probably going to have some come up later. So check it again after, let's say, 2-3 weeks. If you see any that's starting to come up again, a second application is called for.
But that initial treatment should happen in the next few days if you can squeeze it in before rains come.
That's right. If you can get it in, that'd be good. Even if you don't, it's still worth going ahead and spraying. It's just that second application, you may be going after more plants.
If one is successful in knocking down nutsedge this season, will it return next year, or can one really put the hammer on this for good?
Well, my guess is you're going to have a few plants that show up next year. And so you may have to do another cleanup next year, but it's going to be a whole lot easier than it would be for the current year.
But the point is, with this particular grassy weed species, if you let it go, it will consume your lawn eventually.
It will. It just makes it look really bad. I mean, it doesn't so much squeeze out the good grass as it just makes it look bad because it's faster growing and lighter green.
Yeah. So nutsedge control, time to jump on that as soon as you possibly can, homeowners. The other pest is an irritant and then some to homeowners. White grubs. How does one know for sure if, in fact, that's their lawn issue, Ward?
Usually this problem shows up in the fall, and you get large irregular areas that just go off color and die. The other thing that you look for is there are certain birds that'll feed on these, and there are other wildlife that'll feed on these. If it's birds, you're going to see holes in the lawn where they're pecking down and getting the grubs. If it's skunks, and it can be, they are really neat. They'll just lay that turf over and eat the grubs. Raccoons tear it apart. So it's usually raccoons or skunks, but how they act is a little bit different. But if you see your lawn is kind of torn up, usually it's going to be the wildlife, and what they're after is the grubs.
So at this stage, here we are approaching the middle part of summer. What should one be doing about white grubs now?
So first of all, if you've never had a problem with white grubs, I wouldn't worry about it yet. We do have some products where you can apply after the grub damage has appeared. Now, what we're going to recommend today are not those. They're ones that are called grub preventers, and they're called that. They don't really prevent grubs, they just prevent the damage. So they kill the grubs when they're small long before they cause any damage. And so if you've had a problem in the past, then you probably should be looking at using a product in order to control them.
And what options are available in that sense then?
So there's a number of products. Actually, almost all the products are going to be grub preventers rather than grub killers. If it says 24-hour grub control, that's the killer. You don't want it at this time of year. It's too early for it. But if you're into August or September and you see grub damage, then 24-hour grub control is what you want. But the others like Grub X and a number of other products that have grub in the title are going to be what you want. Those are all going to be granules. We don't have any liquids on the homeowner's side. And so you're going to spread this as a granule, and you have to water it in. Especially with the grub killer, it has to be within 24 hours or it's not going to work. These are a little bit better than that, but it needs to be watered in several days or it may not work. Yeah. And so that's really important to get that done. The other thing to keep in mind is that where I have seen most grub damage is in areas where you have a street light and you have an irrigated lawn and the lawns around you aren't irrigated. Because those adults are attracted to the lights and they're going to find it a lot easier to dig in an area that's watered than one that isn't. And so if you have that type of situation, really be on the lookout for these.
And what time window does one have to treat grubs around now then?
So really you've got till mid-July. So you've got some time in order to get this down. And really, you could go probably a little bit later than that, but it's best you have it down by mid-July, watered in, and you shouldn't have any grub damage.
Yeah. So check your situation with your lawn. If you see signs that grubs are at work, those preventer products would be your option of choice here at this stage of the growing season. Ward, as always, it's good to have you over, and we'll talk other horticultural matters when you return next. Appreciate your time, as always.
You bet.
Ward Upham on nutsedge and grub control in home lawns. He is a horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension on this week's Horticulture segment. That's our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.